All right, shall we start? Okay, welcome to the Middle East panel, still under the big theme of East United States back. So let me introduce our distinguished panelists first, and then I will give you some kind of guideline about questions and etc. Okay, let me start with Dr. Fayed. It's always an honor to have him at the Asan. And Dr. Fayed, Mr. Foreign Minister, is chair and founder of Future for Palestine. And he is a former prime minister and finance minister for Palestine. And he is an inventor of political term, Fayedism, which which focuses on the importance of economic growth and political stability and rule of law. And also, Dr. Fayed has been one of the Time magazine's 100 the most influential people in the world to shape the world. And most importantly, he received his PhD in economics from the University of Texas at Austin, where I got my PhD in political science. And also Professor Karen House studied there too. So this is nicely leads to our second panelist. Professor Karen House, who is yesterday's keynote speaker. So we kind of basically know her insight and assessment about the role of the United States government, probably toward the Middle East for this time. So you know her, but let me just repeat. Okay, Professor House was a former publisher of Wall Street Journal, and she won a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage on the Middle East. And she teaches at Pepperdine University, California right now. And she studied at the University of Texas at Austin. And her major was like journalism, right? All right, then we have Mr. Kwon Hee-seok next to Professor Karen House. Okay, Mr. Kwon is the Director General of Middle East and African Affairs Department at Korea's MOFA. And Mr. Kwon is specializing on international security and conflict resolution, and he has served in Lebanon and Afghanistan and Somalia and former Yugoslavia. So maybe he voluntarily, apply that post for his case study or vice versa. He reads, he writes a lot. Sometimes he does more than, we scholars do. So I really do appreciate his comprehensive knowledge and appreciation about the region. And finally, we have Mr. Sinan Yulgen, and he is the chair of Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies in Istanbul, which is an independent think tank in Istanbul, EDAM. And actually, we had, this Asan Plenum had Sinan 2 or 3 years ago, and he had a really correct prediction about Syria and Iraqi situation right now. So I was really, these days, I was thinking about Sinan's prediction that, oh, wow, he must have a great crystal ball with him. Because he said that exactly 3 years ago, the borderlines in Iraq and Syria will be disappearing. And I said, really? But then it is. So this time, I'm really waiting for your another prediction or insights about, reordering the Middle East. So by the way, Mr. Yulgen, as a former diplomat, he also served in Brazil and in Tripoli too. And right now he's a scholar at Carnegie in Brazil as well. And he studied at the University of Virginia and and College of Europe. Somehow I memorized all you guys' background. Okay, so let us start our panel. Okay, the structure will be like this. We are going to have two rounds. So first round is about the general comment on our issues. So, given your expertise in like ISIS or the role of Turkey or the role of Iran or the role of course the U.S. or the Iranian-Palestinian issue. So what is the most urgent or critical issue under the theme of reordering the Middle East? And also under the another big theme of is the United States back? So, and then the second round will be more like improvising one. After I hear your assessment and your comments about reordering the Middle East, so let me just come up with the more improvising question, and probably related to any policy implication for Northeast Asia or for South Korea, because we are talking about this issue in Korea. So please, the floor is yours, Mr. Pryor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and I thank Asan Forum for inviting me. Great privilege for me to be along with this distinguished panel. To use yesterday's language, I'm a first-time offender in terms of participating in the forum. But let me begin by saying that we're quite privileged, actually, this panel and the work of it, to be doing what we're doing now, shortly after His Highness Prince Turki Al Faisal delivered his keynote this morning, which really sets it out very nicely in terms of the key elements of what is on everybody's mind when it comes to the Middle East, as a matter of fact. The title, Reordering the Middle East, actually, I have to confess, when I first received the invite and I looked at it, and you read with the mind, not the eyes necessarily, I did not read it, Reordering the Middle East. I read it regarding the Middle East. And it was not before I got on the plane that I actually discovered that I had misread it, because, when it comes to the Middle East, the word order of any kind, or reordering, any derivatives of word order, with the possible exception of this order, don't apply, particularly when you look at a region that is in a state of serious turmoil and upheaval. Sadly, in my own assessment, likely to continue to be in this mode for some time to come. I guess in terms of pointing to the most important factors that one has to consider in analyzing the situation, coming to a view as to what the most pressing issues are, I think it will be important to begin with a brief analysis or assessment or rundown, if you will, of the more salient features of the region, but not before I qualify everything I say today by saying, when I say region, I do not mean that whatever I say applies uniformly across the board to all countries or to the same extent. But in the nature of things, when you synthesize and analyze and you want to generalize, it's inescapable that you appear as though you are applying a broad brush to countries that are not necessarily in exactly the same position on with respect to a number of issues and yardsticks that we may apply in analysis. Generally speaking, this is a region that has long suffered from a twin deficit problem, as I call it. One, it's a good governance deficit, and the second is opportunity deficit. Key manifestation of the first one actually is a long-standing tradition of a region run by strong men, quote unquote, in weak states or weak structures. Again, it's generalization. This does not apply across the board or to the same extent, but generally speaking, this is what comes to mind when I say that is a region that has long suffered from a good governance deficit. with the strong men dominating or having virtually complete monopoly over public space. With respect to the second deficit, the opportunity deficit, as I call it, clearest manifestation of it is very high rates of unemployment for a long time, perennial problem, particularly amongst the youth segment of our populations in the Middle East, in the Arab world in particular. Actually, by classifications applied by IFIs and the rest, ours is a region that suffers from the highest rates of unemployment amongst the youth, which is a serious problem. And with it, of course, poverty. These are really the most outstanding, in my view, salient features of the region as one looks at what predated the eruption of the so-called Arab Spring, and what to some extent begins to explain the depth of that eruption, and maybe also its durability, particularly when one begins to factor into the analysis some of what I call the contextual contributing factors. The fact that I call them contextual contributing factors does not mean they are not important. Actually, without them, the Arab Spring would not have been probably as violent, the eruption would not have been as severe, and although it may be premature to say for certain that it's going to be there for a long period of time, the durability of the state of upheaval or turmoil could not be explained. One of them, one of those contributing contextual factors, I think, is we have in the region almost a poetic fascination with the glorious past. An important element or component of it is emphasis on the justness of the ruler or the earlier days of Islam, the Khalifa. I mean, these are important things because this is what people, look at and compare with when they look at what exists today and what existed long time ago during the days of the glorious past, as I explained it. And the appeal to those memories of what existed that could begin to explain what it is that has happened to a region that at some point achieved greatness. And now it finds itself, we're talking about the Arab world, dominated or heavily influenced by competing rivalries by forces and powers that are non-Arab. Israel, Iran, and Turkey. You look at the region, people sort of really frustration and the state of affairs, weakness, if you will, lack of influence over happenings in the region, not to mention beyond it, compared to the influence of these other regional powers. Each has been trying to really assert its influence and extend it. No wonder, particularly after the frustration with several attempts at trying to do something in the immediate aftermath of colonial days, various movements, Arab nationalism and all, did not really provide the answers, and we kept going through one setback through another. This is the general, perception, as I say. And I think, as I mentioned these factors, I say they're contributing contextual factors that really have contributed in a very instrumental way to the state of affairs. The other issue, I think that one cannot but take into account is what I regard or consider as strong interaction between what started out as the Palestinian cause and some 7 decades afterwards started to be referred to as Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I say interaction between that on the one hand, on one track, and domestic politics throughout the Arab world on the other, with it for a long period of time being the single most important cause when you interviewed people or you polled them as to what really they thought was important. And I say interaction because it has influenced domestic politics in the Arab world, and it was influenced by domestic politics in the Arab world in both ways, in a manner that I believe has retarded political progress and development in the Arab world. Most everybody was focused, on this issue. And the fact that it endured for the length of time it did without resolution left people with a deep sense of injustice and something that His Highness, called today hypocrisy, and generally known in the region as double standards. Again, going back to the term that I used, interaction between the Palestinian cause on the other hand and domestic politics in the Arab world on the other. And specifically, I make reference to precisely what His Highness referred to earlier today. Year 1990-91, invasion, subsequent annexation, occupation by Iraq of Kuwait, and the manner in which the world, when you talk about the U.S., is U.S. back, trying to really bring that factor, that theme in, when then President George Bush stood up and said, a line has been drawn in the sand. This occupation shall not stand. That resonated a lot, but in a very negative way in the Arab world. On the one hand, Arabs wanting to see, the invasion, subsequent problems by Iraq dealt with, but on the other, saying how hypocritical. Famous double standard argument. The potency of this argument was missed by many scholars and thinkers and politicians in the global West generally, in the United States. Then the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, had been outstanding for 23, 24 years. And people uniformly were saying, well, how come? How come, as much as we wanted to see Kuwait liberated and the invasion ended and the occupation by Iraq of Kuwait, and how come an occupation, Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory, West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as well as Gaza Strip, then outstanding for the length of time it was, did not get that kind of attention or resolve. To this day, it hasn't. And that's definitely a contributing factor. In the way that I segregate issues, I really do not make a sharp distinction between salient features which I think underlie much of what we see by way of state of anger and depth of it, and a deep sense of injustice that prevails and explains why it is that things are happening the way they are. But those contributing contextual factors are equally important in having shaped developments in the way they occurred and continue to unfold in the region. We'll see how things go going forward, but we're definitely looking at a situation that requires very serious resolve on the part of everyone, and reconsideration, if reordering is part of what people are thinking about, of how to address the issues. There's no question that the grotesque violence, with it being as extreme and diabolical as has been, needs to be confronted. There is no question about that. But the issue is, how do you deal with what has really led to a state where there are pockets of sympathy, if you will, and I say this with severe trepidation and sadness, for movements and organizations that are about nothing but destruction, like Daesh, for example. It's a combination of those factors and the confluence of those factors actually that can begin to explain that depth of anger and sense of injustice. How to overcome this beyond the need to confront the violence, obviously, in the strongest possible way, by dealing with those underlying causes that had, as a matter of fact, provided the fertile soil for there to be not necessarily the violence itself that can happen anywhere in the world, as a matter of fact, but the fact that there is not acquiescence to it, but at least what I can describe, I think, fairly and objectively, some pockets of understanding and sympathy. This is a very serious problem for the leadership of the Arab world, and as a matter of fact, for the international community as it deals with this region. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fayed. It's really impressive interpretation about the current situation in the Middle East. So, okay, Professor House, it's your turn, please.
I think it's necessary to say at the outset that I have never seen a subject on which there are so few new ideas, how to fix, reorder, improve the Middle East. So I will be humble in my remarks. I won't repeat what I said yesterday or Prince Turkey said this morning about what I regard as the fundamental lack of American interest in the Middle East, other than in establishing Iran as our new strategic partner. And as Henry Kissinger and George Shultz wrote in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, partnership and cooperation are not about feeling good. You have to have some common goal, and as they pointed out, there is no common understanding between the U.S. and Iran about how the region ought to operate, because the Iranians are in a very expansionist mode, and I do not believe it is U.S. policy, even Obama's policy, to unleash Iran on the entire region, but that is the effect of our policy, unfortunately. So the winner in the region now, as I see it, is Iranian hegemony. And secondly, Assad. Assad has been given a new lease on life in Syria. The loser is U.S. credibility in the region, and it is making Saudi Arabia, as His Royal Highness explained this morning, become much more activist in organizing for its own defense and influence in the region. So what should the U.S. do? I think we're not going to become deeply militarily involved, and I don't think it's necessary. I don't think that's what anyone is actually looking for. But we do need to understand that pinpricks are not going to alter ISIS, that even if we succeed in knocking out a few leaders here and there, it is much more, as Ellen Leibson said yesterday in another session in here, it's much more than a terrorist organization. It's an entity with a goal to establish a state. And to pick up on something Dr. Fayed said, I think the young people in the Arab world are, too many of them are unemployed, and too many of them are overexposed to hypocrisy by their own governments, by our government. I mean, his Kuwait West Bank example is one, but there are many. And thanks to the internet and social media, everybody knows a lot more. So their own governments are less legitimate in their eyes, and we're certainly less legitimate. But we have to understand that, in my view, we can't fix the frustration of young Arabs at what they regard as hypocrisy all around. And I think many of them, at least that I talk to, see Islam as the way to restore justice, that somehow we're going to, if we really have an Islamic society, this is going to rid us of the Western influence, rid us of regimes that have taken advantage of us, so that it is going to take a long time, I think, for Muslims in the Muslim world to work out what is the proper Islam. And is ISIS really consistent with the Islam of the Prophet? I made my students this year read Sayyid Qutb's Milestones, which is a kind of Bible of radicalism, and write a paper about whether these views are consistent with the Islam of the Prophet's time. my own view is that it is not, but I think that's a debate that Muslims themselves need to have, and we need to educate our American public that, again, as Prince Turki said this morning, that if we continue to recede in the region, thinking that Iran or Saudi Arabia or any combination is going to keep order out there, I think we in the whole world will be the losers from that. So we need to encourage Muslim countries who have credibility on Islam to actually try to educate young Muslims why ISIS is not consistent with the Prophet. And we need to educate our own people that this is going to take at least a generation, that we can't fix this, so we can't get out there and just like mop the spilled Coke off the floor. It is going to take a lot of time, and we have to be patient. As one of the panelists on the terrorism, I don't remember who, panel set up here yesterday, and as Dr. Kurchitsin said yesterday on the terrorism panel, I think we have to encourage the idea of more liberty for young people in the Arab world, that we as Americans need to at least express consistently our own ideals and encourage others to give their own people a bit more say and dignity in their own lives, and be willing to engage with our friends in the region, and indeed be willing even to put this dreadful word, boots on the ground, in the form of special forces and intelligence forces that help the people in the region. If they're willing to fight ISIS, we should be willing to support that in every way possible. Not to do it for them, but to help them do it. But fundamentally to recognize this is a long-term problem, and we all have to have patience.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor House and Mr. Guan. Could you please?
Thank you, Dr. Zhang. Having heard from both distinguished speakers, I'd like to focus on the high politics about the Middle Eastern situation. Folks are saying that the Middle East has been undergoing a great transformation. Indeed, last June, ISIL launched a blitzkrieg campaign and occupied Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. And in Libya, the Islamist militias have expelled the legitimate interim government from Tripoli to the eastern provinces. And the chaos is still continuing today. And also, back to back with this, the Gaza war suddenly erupted after the demise of the Palestinian-Israeli peace negotiations, which was initiated by John Kerry in the summer of 2013. So this is the state of affairs of the Middle East today. And we in the Foreign Ministry streamlined all these complex challenges into three conceptual sets of traditional crisis, new crisis, and mutant crisis. The traditional crisis may include, number one, Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. Number two, the terrorism by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Maghreb, and also ABM in Sinai, AAS in Libya, and the Iranian multifaceted challenges of nuclear development, human rights, and terrorism issues. The second set of crises, which are new crises, are talking about the situation in those countries where Arab Spring was erupted. following the 2010 Tunisian crisis. A youth in Tunisia set himself on fire in protest against police abuse, the lack of job opportunity, and corruption, and also in particular despair. So this situation in Tunisia has spread eastward, engulfing Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, and Syria. Those crises we are witnessing today in Libya, Yemen, Syria are the leftovers of Arab Spring, which has already turned into Arab Winter. And the last set of crises, which I termed as a mutant crisis, is ISIL challenge. ISIL used to be one of the Syrian rebel groups, and it mutated out of the protracted Syrian conflict. So having said that, as we seek to find leverages to reorder the Middle East toward a better future, the nuclear deal with Iran may provide a unique opportunity to do so. See the other crises, as I described a couple of minutes ago. The Israeli-Palestinian conflicts would remain intractable for the foreseeable future, and the terrorism in all parts of the Middle East will persist. And Libya, Yemen, and Syria will continue to be in flames for the time being. And given all these situations, Iran's nuclear negotiations, if it is successfully concluded, I think we will have the potential to transform the whole Middle Eastern political landscape. There are perhaps three scenarios for the day after. First, deepening crisis between Iran and the West or the rest. Second, an expansionist Iran. Third, Iran the stabilizer or junior security partner for the United States. As there's a high hope for the nuclear deal with Iran by the end of June, I would rule out the first scenario of a confrontation with Iran. If the nuclear talks are successfully concluded, Iran may have two options. Number one, Iran will act as an expansionist, pursuing regional hegemony, as eloquently described by Her Royal Highness Prince Turki this morning, and also Ms. Karen House yesterday in their keynote addresses. Iran will flex its muscle and project its influence over the region, and it will reassert its traditional authority and prestige as the leader of the Shiite world in the region. Or Iran will act as a stabilizer or security partner. Iran will play a constructive role in managing and controlling the Shiite belt running through Iraq, southern Syria, southern Lebanon, and perhaps in Yemen. And it will control all these Shia belts, and also it will help the United States and others in managing the whole situation in the Middle East. So that's up to Iran's choice. And the Sunni countries in the Middle East perhaps would react to the Iranian resurge by regrouping themselves into Sunni Arab United Front. In these united fronts, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states would try to collaborate with Egypt and GCC. Whether these countries would further coalesce with Turkey or ISIL remains to be seen. So the whole Middle Eastern situation would depend on what would happen with Iran after the deal is concluded by the end of June. So here I would stop, and as we continue our discussions, I would make further comments on the situation.
Okay, thank you so much, DG Kwon. And Sinan, it's your turn, so show us your prediction again.
Thank you for your kind words. I will try to be somewhat speculative and provocative as I was in the initial time that I was invited by Asan. But let me start with an anecdote. Apparently, during the height of the negotiations between Israelis and the Palestinians early on in the last decade, an advisor of the Israeli prime minister goes to the prime minister and says, "Mr. Prime Minister, we have one good news and one bad news." So he goes, "Okay, what's the good news?" And the good news is, we see the light at the end of the tunnel. Oh, says, very, very good news. So what's the bad news? Well, the bad news is there's no tunnel. So when I look at the situation in the Middle East today, I'm trying to find what the tunnel can be in terms of recreating order. And my speculative statement would be that I know when stability will, when we can look at the region and ensure that there is stability. I know the answer to that question, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. I look at the region through the prism of legitimacy. I think what we see today, and here I'm talking mostly about now, Iraq, Syria, that part of the Middle East, is really a deep crisis of legitimacy. In a way, this is part of the struggle of finding the right sources of legitimacy, going back almost 100 years, going back almost to the post-Ottoman era, post-World War era, where these states were created almost by people sitting in offices, drawing lines on the map, and creating these states. So that's where the source or the origin of the problem is, because since then there have been a number of iterations about how to recreate an order based on lasting legitimacy. And that failed. Initially it was the colonial order, then it was minority dictatorships, and now what we see is that this has not really been able to glue those societies together, to create a sense of togetherness, a sense of nationhood that would prevail and that would enable these societies to face up the challenges that they face. Again, these are, in a way, if you want, the trajectory of history. And here, it's more about what some people call these contrived states. These are, the more artificial states that were created, multi-confessional, multi-ethnic. And that weren't really able to bring out the type of sources of legitimacy. Now, there are other countries in the same region. One example is Jordan. The other one is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, that they have been able to create already this feeling of togetherness, of nationhood. And a lot of that has to do with the other aspect of legitimacy, which is output legitimacy. I talked about mostly the input legitimacy, namely the way that you form the state, the foster a society. But there's also an aspect about output legitimacy, which is how you care for your population, the good governance principles, how you run the economy, how you deliver basic services, and there's a lot of that that's also linked to this concept of legitimacy. But nonetheless, when I look at this situation, I think that much of the conflict that we see today, especially again in these type of more states, is the result of this unfinished business for a quest of legitimacy. It's about how diverse people are to regroup to create new political identities from themselves after the collapse of the old order, which they had grown accustomed to. And that, I think, is exactly what we're seeing in Syria. That's exactly what we're seeing in Iraq. And this really is not something that can be imposed from above. So my first message when we talk about what the US role should be, and I think I should make this into an even more perhaps ambitious message for the international community as a whole, is that first of all, be humble. I think Karen House already used this word. I think when you will look at the history of past interventions in the Middle East, the first message that I would like to share with you is really be humble, and second, do no harm. That's also been used in the past, but not really being followed. I think the intervention in Iraq in 2003 is the example of this. I would say don't append a social order that can't be rebuilt within a reasonable frame of time. The second policy conclusion that follows from these two prescriptions is really reconsider the feasibility of state building. When the U.S. intervened in Iraq in 2003, I think they were somewhat blinded by the difficulty of rebuilding legitimacy. That was, and it took really more than a decade for Iraq to reach a semblance of normalcy. And I think that even today, the country is suffering from the impact of that intervention. My third message is for the international community is basically deal today, when I look again at Syria and Iraq, and take in consideration the first two messages of don't do harm, be humble, but there's still something that can be done. And I think that is particularly true when we look at the ramifications of this conflict for the whole of the region. And I think that's really, we can deal with the consequences of the regional disorders, even if we can't tackle the root causes of that regional disorder. Because again, I think that the root causes have to do with this, rebuilding legitimacy, and that's up to the local actors to do. Regional actors can contribute, but essential responsibility rests with the local actors. There is little that can be done from the outside, especially from actors that not from the region. But for the international community as a whole, there is possibility to do good, to do positive things by trying to appease at least the very negative consequences of this regional disorder. The refugee crisis is one case in point. Many of the countries in the region, Turkey is one hosting about 1.7 million Syrian refugees, Jordan about 1.4 million, that's about 20% of the population of Jordan, Lebanon along similar numbers. And this puts a huge burden on those countries, not only a material burden, but it's also social burden, and long-term, it's an immense threat to the stability of the region. Because if you can't care for those populations, if you can't provide them with decent prospects for the future, these are exactly the populations that will be prone to radicalization. And I think this is something that the international community should reconsider. Already in Europe, we're seeing, I talked about Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, but look at Europe. Look at, what you're reading in the press. Look at all these humanitarian crises with people trying to cross the Mediterranean, find a better home for themselves, just to rebuild a future for themselves. This is a tragic humanitarian situation. I think much more needs to be done here. If there is willingness in the international community to really deal with the consequences of these crises, this is the area where a lot of the effort should be streamlined. So I think, and this is, I would like to end perhaps this first round with my key message here is that I think forging a new bottom-up social compact within the region's existing borders will be the responsibility of the local populations. And I don't think that the instability will end until we reach that stage. And my sort of message of humbleness is that there is actually little that can be done from the outside to impose this type of legitimacy on the domestic populations. But there's a lot that can be done from the outside to at least appease, mitigate the impact, the security spillovers, but especially the humanitarian spillovers of this ongoing disorder.
Okay, thank you so much, Sinan. Okay, so it's time for me to come up with an improvised keyword for our second round. And then I just look at my clock, then we have only 30 more minutes, and I know that we have, tremendously distinguished audience right now. So So what about I just come up with an improvised keyword for all of us, and then let's open the floor to the audience, and then we are going to talk about it. So I think our new keyword is going to be injustice. Is that correct? Deep sense of injustice, and the lack of legitimacy in various levels, in domestic, regional, in international community, especially, including the role of the United States and UN, etc. And you talk about, state craftsmanship. So we need to fix the injustice problem. Probably like mainly in domestic state building issue, and Professor House, you said that you might want to focus on the proper education or appropriate education for U.S. citizen about the Middle East issue, and etc. in order to resolve the injustice issue. And Mr. Kwan says that. He said that the Iranian interim nuclear agreement will provide a good opportunity for the Middle East because he had 3 different scenarios about that deal. Then my just short question is that, but then Mr. Kwan, many people in the region think that the Iranian nuclear deal itself is the beginning of the injustice because that deal just closed the eyes about the human tragedy and the injustice in Syria and Assad regime and etc. So we probably wanted to talk about, hear from you about that. And Sina, you said that we need to focus on bottom up kind of formula in order to fix, the lack of legitimacy and injustice, and etc. So this kind of, short summary of our first round, and let us just open the floor for the audience. So, His Royal Highness, please.
3 points on legitimacy. Definitely having a strong central government in countries provides, if not immediately, then eventually a legitimacy, because that central government will be able to provide the social services and other requirements of a society. And this ties in with Iran's future intentions. If we look at Lebanon as an example, Iran's relationship with Hezbollah has been based on a weak central government so that Hezbollah can maintain its prerogatives and advantages over the other political parties in Lebanon, to the point where now there is no president in Lebanon. Because of Hezbollah's position against all potential candidates for the presidency. And this is what Iran is doing in Syria as well, supporting a leader who lost legitimacy, yet is beholden to Iran and will maintain that link in order to preserve his own position. In Iraq, the Shia militias have outgunned the Iraqi army, and therefore Iran's influence in Iraq will be maintained because of that strong presence of the Shia militias in Iran, in spite of a government that is recognized worldwide and so on. The same can be said for the Houthis. Their overturn of the legitimate government was an attempt to establish a model like the one in Lebanon, where an extra powerful militia, political party, etc., will remain as the main factor in deciding central government positions without necessarily themselves being the central government. And so this is, I think, where Iran is heading with the nuclear deal, and will be relieved of the sanctions and so on, and be strengthened to maintain that kind of relationship with these Arab countries, and they hope with other Arab countries in the future. On the nuclear deal, what I didn't mention in my presentation, and a subject that always comes up whenever the people who want to sell the deal always say, what is the alternative? This is all we can do at the moment, and therefore there is no alternative. The point is, there is an alternative. The alternative was mentioned by Secretary Kerry yesterday in his speech to the NPT review conference in New York, which is the zone free of weapons of mass destruction. If the time that had been spent on negotiating with Iran from 2002, that's nearly 13 years until today, had been spent on establishing a zone free of weapons of mass destruction, I dare say that we would have been a long way along that establishment of the zone, rather than simply Iran being singled out as a negotiating partner for the P5+1 on Iran's particular nuclear deal, whereas the rest of us in the area will now use this deal in order to acquire at least the same skills as the Iranians are acquiring in the meantime. And on the issue of ISIS, or I prefer to call it Fahish, in Arabic Fahish, which rhymes with Daesh, the Arabic name for ISIS. Fahish means obscene, and I think that's the only way to describe Fahish. And you're right, Ms. House, it does not represent Islam as the Prophet practiced it, or as the rest of us in the world. 1.5 billion Muslims from the Atlantic all the way across to the Pacific, they practice Islam in the way that hopefully is peaceful, is productive and contributive to humanity. And to call this really obscene group the Islamic State is an offense to the 1.5 billion Muslims throughout the world. So please, if any of you or any of the audience refers to this group, don't call them ISIS, or don't call them Daesh, just call them Fahish, please. Thank you.
Ambassador Chen.
Well,
please.
I'm Chen Yong, former National Security Advisor to President Lee Myung-bak. May I pick up from where His Royal Highness left off on the implications of Iran deal on the geopolitics of the Middle East? I have a hard time, making sense of what's going on there in terms of restructuring of the geopolitical landscape, maybe driven by the Iranian deal and ISIS, the combat against ISIS. I understand that President Obama is trying to put best face on the deal, but I'm wondering, how the U.S. Maybe a tacit U.S. alliance with Iran in combating ISIS is going to affect the balance of power between Sunni and Shia in the in the Arab world. That's one question, and maybe this is combating ISIS is about a battle of winning the hearts and minds of the Arab streets, Arab grassroots, and even though the Arab ruling elites, the governments, may need U.S. combating, or they would benefit from U.S. combat against ISIS. Maybe, I'm not sure whether this is going to be helpful in reducing the hostility of the Arab streets toward the West. So I'm wondering whether this battle against ISIS is going to be helpful in reducing the what one could describe as misunderstanding or hostility of these Sunni fundamentalists or Shia fundamentalists against the West. Another question I have is about the security dynamics that Iran nuclear deal will have. Well, I think that, may I have one more minute? I think that despite all the lip service to the merits of the deal, I'm also cognizant of what Professor Karen House said yesterday in the keynote address. I think what is important for Iran to to develop nuclear weapons at a later date at this point, is to master the technology of enrichment. And they haven't conceded anything on that front. Whether they have 19,000 centrifuges or 5,060 centrifuges doesn't matter. What they got is the recognition of the legitimate right to enrich uranium. And they may retreat from the nuclear threshold to maybe 12 months now, but 10 years from now, they'll be back to 3 months from the nuclear threshold. And what I'm concerned about is this could give a pretext or could legitimize Saudi claim or Turkish claim to enrichment. So I don't know how we can ban enrichment spreading or constrain enrichment spreading to other countries which may feel threatened by the rise of Iran and the U.S. pivot to Iran. So I think that could fundamentally reshape the geopolitics in the Middle East, and it will have serious implications for the nuclear proliferation as well. So I would like to hear the views of the panel.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Chen. So let me gather just two more questions. I just, Dr. Imbar, I just saw him before. Sorry, earlier. Yeah.
Usually in my country, the person sitting behind an important person is his bodyguard. I am not. I would like to call a spade a spade. Basically, the Iranian emerging deal could make the Middle East even worse than it is now. Because, as it was pointed out, it may bring about nuclear proliferation. And a multipolar nuclear Middle East is a strategic nightmare. And many more people can get killed if the bad guys take power. A second issue, which I would like to point out, I was really surprised by the remarks of a distinguished representative of MOFA, Korea. Do you really think that Iran is going to be a security partner with the United States? They say openly their goal is to eject the United States from the region.
That's one of the scenario. Okay, and then I will get back to you. Yeah. Ms. Kang Hyung-kyung from Korea Times.
My point is not about injustice or legitimacy. My point is about the strategy. Actually, there is no question that after the Iran deal, the Middle East has become much more complex and complicated, because we have seen the Saudi-led airstrikes against Houthis in Yemen, and we also see the signs of arms race in the Middle East, because the Saudi, I saw the media coverage there. The Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, they expressed their interest in purchasing more state-of-the-art arms from the United States, like F-15 or F-35. I'm not familiar with that kind of materials, but what I'm thinking is that these Gulf states are trying to purchase, the arms race are going on in the Middle East because they are trying to counter the threat possibly posed by the Iran, right? Then what I'm thinking is, who is going to benefit from what's happening in the Middle East right now? I think there is only one entity that is really benefiting from this kind of, turmoil and crisis. That is ISIS, I think, because this actually led me to think that, why isn't it fair? Is it for me too naive to say that since the ISIS poses a common threat to all the countries, then we can focus, all the Middle Eastern countries can first be united to counter the common threat first, and then they can discuss about other security issues like Iranian nuclear deals and the possible consequences later. So that's what I'm thinking, because we are actually, the Middle East is actually dealing with several threats right now, right? So the ISIS is one of them, and the other, the complicated geopolitics. So what I'm thinking is, why don't the entire Middle Eastern countries, they are just united to fight against the common threat first, and then deal with other, other regional issues. That's what I'm thinking.
Okay, thank you. I just got the warning sign about we have only 15 more minutes, so let me just come back to our distinguished panelists. So, okay, we have kind of 4 to 6 different questions. So, okay, why don't we start to answer to the question from Sinan's side? So you have specific questions, right? So just try to answer to.
Yes, I'll try to answer. Take up at least the question on Iran and nuclear proliferation. On enrichment, the NPT is interpreted by the states in the region as given the right to domestic enrichment, provided that the states are compliant with their NPT commitments. So, unlike the UAE, which has given the guarantee that it will not enrich in the future, the other states in the Middle East, that can be Turkey, that can be others, have not given a guarantee that they won't enrich, because they believe they have the right. That's a sovereign right under the NPT. Again, provided that they comply with the NPT's requirements. So I think it's not going to be, we won't cover much mileage if we try to impose a new commitment to states that are already compliant with NPT. So the issue is, to me, not whether we can limit the spread of enrichment. The issue is whether we can strengthen the international regime in terms of both verifications and enforcement if we foresee, if we envisage, if we see that there's a violation of the NPT commitments. That, to me, is the issue. And when I look at the Iran deal, I see that there's a special regime that's imposed on Iran. And that special regime goes beyond the additional protocol, which is already an instrument available, and it provides for more intrusive inspections of Iran's infrastructure. So for me, the deal is, it may have its flaws, but nonetheless, it is better than a no deal in preventing proliferation, because I can't understand the logic of trying to undermine the deal under the pretense that it would lead to proliferation, compared to a scenario where there's no deal, which surely would have led to proliferation.
Okay, thank you for the questions and comments. I want to react to several as shortly as possible. On the legitimacy issue, I think that there are 2 sets of debate here about high politics and low politics. Low issues deals with the economic and social issues. And many people were speaking about legitimacy and the poverty, lack of job opportunity, and the youth problem. And I think these are longer-term challenges to make the Middle East brighter, more prosperous, economically stronger. While some people, including myself, discussed the high politics of the military, political, diplomatic affairs. So I think these two dimensions should be addressed effectively, skillfully, to make a better Middle East. And number two, in response to His Royal Highness Prince Turki, although Sinan has said, actually when the United States and others proceeded with this nuclear negotiation with Iran over the years, there was a premise that any deal may be better than no deal because there was no alternative. But Prince Turki has challenged this assumption by providing the idea of establishing Middle Eastern nuclear weapon-free zone, WMD-free zone. Of course, this issue has been heavily discussed in and outside the NPT venue, but yet I think from my perspective as the former nuclear expert, it's not really viable idea, viable alternative. For example, if someone suggests the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone in Northeast Asia or in East Asia, first, those who are willing to have this zone, such as South Korea, Taiwan, Mongolia, agree on the establishment of that zone, and later we'll be waiting for Japan to join. But I think this is not really workable from the Korean perspective. If we establish that kind of a nuclear weapon-free zone in Northeast Asia, from the start, we should have Japan inside. So according to Prince Turki's argument, we should first establish nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East without Iran, and we can invite Iran to join it. Otherwise, we will continue to impose penalty on Iran. I am wondering whether this idea is really be working in the real world. And third, about the U.S. involvement in the Middle East, I think the U.S. had practiced so-called balance of power approach, starting from 1945, the end of the Second World War, until 1990, the end of the Cold War. After that, President Clinton started from 1993, practiced dual containment of Iran and Iraq, which has not been quite successful, and followed up by President Bush for regional transformation in Iraq and Afghanistan. We know the outcome of this American foreign policy vis-a-vis the Middle East. So the subsequent Obama administration has practiced the limited engagement. And President Obama has eloquently summed up his policy vis-a-vis the world and the Middle East in particular in his speech before the military academy in 2014. And that has been summed up as a limited involvement. So today he's staging airstrikes on Iraq and Syria without boots on the ground. So this kind of American foreign policy will continue during his tenure. But as we speculate, if President Clinton comes to power the following year, in 2016, many speculate that she will revert to the previous containment policy against Iran and for the broader Middle East. Because she more or less belongs to the pre-war generation, as she was born by 1947. During her tenure of 4 years or 8 years, the American foreign policy toward the world may revert to the old practice of containment policy. But after that, the new American presidents will be much younger. After being born, after the Second World War has ended, and these new generation of American leaders will have adopted more or less limited engagement vis-a-vis the world. So this is a continuing debate in the American foreign policy establishment between isolationists versus interventionists. But as we go through the younger generations, the pendulum will be swung toward isolationists. And the last comment from our Israeli specialist, I want to react to his comment about Iran as potential security partner. I think I've been discussing, I want to preclude this possibility myself, but I was discussing the whole continuum of scenarios, possibilities, starting from different crises between Iran and the West and rest, and also Iranian expansionist ambitions, hegemonic ambitions, perhaps in the middle. And the right-hand side of the continuum, Iran, may be elevated to security stabilizer, something like that. So this is a value-free statement. I have my own personal perspectives of what Iran should be, Iran should look like, but we can discuss these things after the session. But there are, all these kind of speculations about Iran's potential role in the future Middle East. I will stop here. There's a warning. Thank you.
I just want to, in response to you and to you, yes, the U.S., Iran, the Saudis are all fighting ISIS, but that doesn't, to quote Netanyahu, the enemy of my enemy is still my enemy. That does not make Iran a strategic partner. So my point number one is Iran is not, we shouldn't see Iran and this nuclear deal as a solution to disorder in the Middle East. It will, as I believe, as His Royal Highness already said, it will open the door to proliferation. And I understand his proposal for a nuclear-free region. The issue is, how do you get Israel into that? And now, how do you get Iran into it? But when, maybe you want to explain your own, but when there is one nuclear power out there now, Israel, and there is Iran, who is determined to become one and will become one. So I think we will see, as His Royal Highness has said, and others, we will see other countries pursue the same ambition. So it's destabilizing, not stabilizing.
Thank you. A few general comments, briefly. My own feeling is that this whole phenomenon of extreme violence and lack of stability is the reflection of disillusionment come rejectionism. And I say this to suggest, in my own way, that the role of religion in this, I think, has been overplayed in two senses. One, in the extent to which it has been used to justify or otherwise explain, rationalize what Fahish has been up to, for example. And two, religion has also been played up in the sense of sectarian differences having been played up, especially amongst policymakers in the global West. This is not something that has been with us forever. It's sort of really metamorphosed into, from it being kind of referred to as a sectarian difference or sectarian differences, to sectarian tensions, to sectarian fault lines. I mean, I think this is dangerous, to the point where a very senior US official looking at the Middle East through the prism of sectarianism, very senior official, referring to the Iranians, I'm almost quoting, not necessarily verbatim, he said, they're referring to the Iranians, they are like us, they are more like us, as opposed to Sunni Muslims. I mean, this is, I think, catastrophic way of looking at the region. The US has not been lacking in influence in the region for it to go, fade away, come back. But I think wrong calls have been made. And I think recent years twice, that's my own sense, Once in the sense of there being a bet on Muslim Brotherhood being the answer to the West's worry about terrorism, and another time in terms of changing that bet all the way up to including Iran as being the answer to the West's problems. Final point, when I talked about rejectionism, and let me close on interventionism. I think it's too late, I hope not, but I think it's too late for the Iranian nuclear deal to be an opportunity to do something good. I hope it's not too late, but my sense is that it is. In two senses. One, basic approach or design issues that relate to what's been discussed, Iran's own nuclear capability. But the second sense in which I think it may be too late, I hope it is not, to do something good with it, is the fact that it did not deal with an important aspect of what Iran has been up to. Not only Iran, interventionism. End of the day, a deal is a deal, and it's going to be about Iran's nuclear capability. But what has that deal, or what have those discussions or negotiations led to, if anything at all, insofar as Iran's interventionism in the Arab world? And several places have been mentioned that I agree. I mean, these are important issues, bilateral issues for us Arabs. Part of the responsibility falls squarely with us. We really need to address those issues as Arabs. We really need to have this discussion. But I think we should have been encouraged to do it. And I think Iran should have been really actually been called on those issues, as opposed to just limiting it to the nuclear file and then basically let Iran do whatever Iran wants to do elsewhere in the region, whether in Lebanon, whether in Yemen, whether in Syria, and all of that. My very last point is business about lack of regional order, lack of world order. Major failure in so far as what happened in Syria. And I agree, it will take more than pinpricking to actually deal with Fahish, as the Royal Highness calls it. With all the bombing that has taken place, is still in control of the equivalent of Syria's total area, both in Iraq and Syria. This is going to be a long drawn-out battle. Important, therefore, for all of us to really focus on these other elements. Long-term, yes, but we need to begin. Social contract is our responsibility. But I think it's really important for that to be understood also by the powers to be, in order for the US to be truly back in terms of ideals of what it said it has maintained post-war, World War, as being its own role and responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I need to apologize because I just got the please end sign. So I am forced to end the session. I am sorry. But we have, break time, so we will have lots of, more vivid discussions after the session. Please join me thanking our panelists. Thank you.